Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Obviously, I was really pleased to be elected the Member of Parliament for Streatham, my home, my entire life. But just before that, it was the privilege of my life to be able to work as Chief of Staff and Political Advisor to Diane Abbott MP, who was at the time the Shadow Home Secretary, and to help form what is, I believe, and then this isn't just because I was doing it, the best Home Office policy we've seen from a Labour Party in some time. I think it's always been very difficult with Home Office policy because there's always this desire, I think, to make it seem tough, to make it seem hard, and not think about how Home Office policy affects individuals' lives. Is often about rhetoric and not about people. And what is the office of the home if not about people? And I think it's really important that under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, we formulated a Home Office policy that was rooted in human rights. The idea that we would have policy that was not that didn't have to be rooted in human rights because it was all about our protection, didn't make any sense, because actually it always ends up working the other way. I think it's a massive mistake. It's outdated, it's expensive, it costs a human life. The cost of paying compensation for making so many mistakes, and then on top of that, finding that all of your policies are eventually a failure. So police that don't police by consent doesn't work. A fire service that isn't properly resourced doesn't work. A counter-terrorism bill that works against our communities instead of for our communities doesn't work. And an immigration policy that is inhumane and built on racism doesn't work either, because it eventually ends up not only destroying people's lives but destroying our economy. So, talking on policing first, it was very important that we looked at all public sector workers and, tried to get a situation where they were given that pay rise. That was central to our policy. And in terms of numbers, thinking about the fact that every single sector has been cut, and that put a lot of pressure on those individual resources. Now, I know some people weren't necessarily happy about that, but it's very, very clear that if we are to continue in this situation where we're talking about policing by consent, the police would have to be properly resourced, but not just that, they'd have to be proper community police officers, not just the police officers that we see today who are so overstretched that they come across in a van, when something goes wrong, sirens blazing, no real foot in the community, and everything's really hustle and bustle. That's not the way to police a community. And that's not right. But in the same breath, as well as supporting their need for greater resources, we had to, and always were consistent in, no matter whether, it gained criticism, which it did, racist stop and search. You cannot police a community by consent if you come across as their oppressors and not people that work for them. And I'm thinking particularly about Black communities who are, over-policed as citizens and under-policed as victims, and that was something that definitely needed to change. And there are many different measures which the police should really have been taken to, and we were adamant on calling it out when we saw it, but also putting down very clear policy proposals as to how we should look at changing things. Proper training for police, creating a situation where they're not so overstretched, and making it clear, abundantly clear, with better recording and things such as that targeting specific communities is absolutely unacceptable. And one situation in which this has become major is in the policy on drugs. Now, at this point in time, we all know that our drugs policy isn't working. Over the past 10 years in particular, it's been ideological and plagued with cuts. So all of those resources that you would usually put into drug treatment has been cut down. So we are now the overdose capital of Europe. That's what the UK is now. It's simply not working. And I will say that the drugs issue is as much a social justice issue as it is a public health issue, because drug policy has been routinely used to discriminate against black communities. And then we've seen again and again, you know, if you're a young black boy in my area and you're caught with drugs, you will face harsh consequences. But if you admit to taking drugs as a member of parliament, you are more likely to end up in at the top of the leadership contest for the Conservative Party. And we know that there are drugs being used amongst, you know, bankers in the bars in this city again and again, and we've heard again and again how people are going to be tough on them. But there is such a disproportionate level of policing in terms of policing white people when it comes to drugs and black people when it comes to drugs. Now, you don't have to be on either side. Now, there are many people that are very, very concerned about people overusing drugs, misusing drugs, and wanting drug levels, drug usage to go down. And there's some people that want it to be more liberalized. Whichever side you are on, it's clear that the policy we have at the moment is not working. And we've seen in other countries where you know, drug reforms have changed this. And it seems strange to say that either decriminalizing makes a difference, because it's like, oh gosh, it's a free-for-all. But evidence shows us that it might not necessarily be. And obviously we have to look at things in our country's context. And I think it's really, really important that first we call that discrimination in terms of the length of, well, actually the type of punishment that you are given if you are black, or if you are white, if you are privileged, if you are not. But also to look at the evidence so that we are making sure that we are saving lives. Now, it's very, very important. Well, no, it's the most important job of a government is to keep its citizens alive. And, you know, our drug policy isn't simply doing that. So in line with our route on policing, one of the policies was to call a royal commission on drugs. Now, it gets very political in terms of who supports it and who's not. So the idea was we would ask the experts. The experts would give us the answers, and that is what we would put. That is what we put down as a policy. No politics, no individual, you know, opinions in this. We'd be putting forward what the experts tell us to. And I think that is definitely the most sensible way to do it, because there is so much hypocrisy. I mean, the Labour Party were very active last year in particular in trying to make sure that medical marijuana or THC oil for young people, in particular children who have very, very serious seizures, was made legal. And still to this day, a number of those poor children in those situations are not getting the medication they need because they find it too often blocked by their doctors and by the Home Office. Yet, did you know that there is a legal marijuana farm in Norfolk? Now, the Home Office, whilst at the same breath having restricted you know, giving medical marijuana to young people that clearly needed it for seizures. People were having seizures like 30 times a day. They gave a license to a company called British Sugar, which also happens, the CEO also happens to be the partner of the minister who used to be responsible for drug policy. And they, with this farm, are allowed to grow medical marijuana and sell it to the US for a profit. Now, I don't get how it works with their taxes, because obviously it's not legal, so it's not clear what they would, you know, what they would charge it under. But the hypocrisy around it was unbelievable. So a royal commission, we believe, would have made things more fair. Now, again, still sticking to the theme of policing, looking at counter-terrorism and the PREVENT programme. Now, it's always been very difficult, because when it comes to issues of terrorism, people are very, very emotive, and the idea that you know, anybody wanting to change certain anti-terror laws doesn't want to protect communities has always been one that's been bandied about, and it's always been unfair in terms of those that recognise the danger that some of these counter-terror policies can have. Now, as far as we were concerned, and as far as we could see again from evidence after evidence, the PREVENT programme was not preventing anything. I mean, I look back to 2017, which, you know, they dubbed the year of terror, of all the different terror attacks, the one in Parliament, the one in London Bridge, and in Manchester. And whilst the Muslim community is often demonised by the PREVENT programme, what we realised when you actually broke it down is in at least 3 of those attacks, and I think there were about 5 that year, in 3 of those attacks, the police were notified and had previously been watching these individuals, and these individuals had been reported to them not by a nosy neighbour that saw a lot of people coming around to visit them one day. They were reported to them by other members of the Muslim community who had seen that they were behaving strangely. And I think that's really important, because it's clear to show that whilst these programs seem to really target the Muslim community was actually willing to work with the authorities to help stop terrorism, but demonizing them in that way does not help. I remember the first encounter I had with this program when I was a student, and representatives at Bradford University. Now, these poor international students simply called home, and they found themselves, because apparently they said the wrong buzzword, you know, in an issue with the police and needing the students' union to support them. It's absolutely disgraceful. And whilst people are, you know, forcing their attention in another way, they're not looking at what's really leading to these issues. And a lot of the time, it just seems that people prevent program money is used for things, and programs and organisations are taking it up to do social care, because they've cut a lot of social care funds. So people are literally taking this money and using it to you know, do their usual work as they would with their community organisations, but just having to report a few people to be watched every once in a while. It became ridiculous. So we were very pleased in the last government to actually get them to get the government to put on the books a review of the Prevent programme. They are, however, in this new kind of revised version of the counter-terrorism bill, delaying it. And in line with Labour policy, I believe that we should absolutely be voting it down and fighting against it, because they promised us that review of Prevent. It needs to be reviewed. It cannot continue as it is. Now, I just want to, because I'm probably running out of time, touch on fire before I touch on immigration, which has been a major policy. So we wanted to make sure that there were 3,000 extra firefighters. Now we know that, again, across the years with austerity, you know, fire services have lost their resources and lost their numbers, and actually they removed certain responsibilities from them in terms of taking ownership of fire safety, which they really should have. And not just that, looking at things that should have been implemented. Now, before the Grenfell Tower fire, there was a fire not so deadly, but a similar fire in South London, in Lacknell House. Now, in Lacknell House, or Lacanau, was pronounced it wrong, after that fire, there was an inquiry and recommendations were put in place, which would have meant that the cladding on Grenfell Tower would never have gone up. And I remember the government at the time, I think it was under coalition government, they were all on a 3-line whip to come in and make sure that they voted down that legislation, because you know what, the majority of them are landlords themselves, and that those measures would have put you know, a lot of pressure on landlords in terms of making sure that they were meeting certain requirements, not just in terms of cladding, but in terms of other things. And you know, it's this kind of, I like to call it selfish policy making, which usually meets the needs and the business interests of certain people in Parliament, which has led to so many tragedies and actually disparities in our society. So that's just a bit on fire. Now, just lastly, on immigration, I think the change in immigration policy for the Labour Party was probably one of the most difficult things to do, and also one of the most amazing things for me personally to do, because having to watch over years, as you know, the party I vote for, the party I was a member of, saying some of the most ridiculous things on immigration in a hope to gain more votes, it just always broke my heart. And then to hear other activists saying, you know, you're supporting the Labour Party, but look at these horrible things that they're saying about immigration, and knowing that actually they were right. Some of the things that were being said were absolutely disgraceful. And for a socialist party to be descending into that rhetoric was absolutely it was one of the things that I think as a younger person, other than student fees, which I'm sure somebody touched on earlier, really it made me take a while to actually join the Labour Party, because I was so disgusted with some of the things that were said. Now, it's looking at it in, from this way. There were, you know, there were a lot of rhetoric with the rise of far-right racism. People finding that they, you know, wanted to out-Tory the Tories, and as Diane always says, you cannot out-Tory the Tories, and we were doing a very bad job of it, as far as I'm concerned. You know, trying to put across that we're tough on immigration, British jobs for British workers, all of these strange things. And actually, do you know what? To our disgrace, some people from the left buying in on it in terms of jobs. Now we know that you know, immigrants do not drive down wages, and this is something that, you know, Diane and Jeremy always very clearly said. Immigrants do not drive down wages. Predatory employers and weakened trade union rights do. And if we tackle those two, we will tackle the scourge of low pay. Not just that, you know, people kept talking about, we need to go around the country, we need to speak to people, we need to listen to their concerns about immigration. I'm not one person that thinks we shouldn't listen to people's concerns, but that type of idea, that we're going around, that we're listening to people, that we're you know, we have to hear what they have to say, and if they say anything horrible, we have to accept it, is just completely wrong. And actually, when you realize that you do go around and you do talk to people, and, you know, when people come back and tell you what these people have said that may have some, what we may call backward views on immigration, do you know, it always goes back to certain things. It goes back to things like housing. It goes back to things like jobs. It goes back to things like education, sorry. It always goes back to things that people feel like they've been denied or they don't have enough of. I mean, there are some people, yes, who are absolutely racist, and that's clear. But people's biggest issues are not black and brown people on the streets. It's about what they do not have. And racist ideology sells them the idea that if these black or brown people were away from here, they would have better housing. If they were away, they would have better jobs. If they were away, they would have better education and opportunities. So actually, if we just fixed those issues, you'd find that people would have less of an issue with so-called migrants on the streets. And I think in all of these let's listen to people conversations, no one seemed to be picking up on that. So when we put together the immigration policy, we started from a place that we thought everybody would understand: family. Everybody understands family. Everybody understands that they want to be around their family and that families shouldn't be separated. And this is particularly at a time when the refugee crisis was at its height across Europe, and actually I wouldn't say was at its height. Just because the news cameras and everybody have kind of moved away from it doesn't mean that it's still not a very, very real issue. But we had an issue of family reunion, and particularly with Brexit coming, whether or not you were for it or against it, the idea that people should be separated and not be able to access what we like to call safe and legal routes, and Dublin 3 regulations that allow people to come in. Actually, Dubs, the Alf Dubs piece of legislation which we put down, which would allow unaccompanied migrants to come in and meet other members of their family here. So we started with that because we wanted people to understand that whereas people keep throwing out rhetoric about people taking resources, actually sometimes it's just about humanity, just about your right to a family life, your right to live freely with your family. And from there, you know, breaking down a lot of those things that I think people don't realize about the hostile environment. The hostile environment completely tore people apart with arbitrary targets, specifically on minimum income thresholds, you know, saying that your partner couldn't come and live with you if you didn't earn a certain amount of money, whilst keeping people's wages low, all of those things. And again, just the idea of the hostile environment, making sure that people felt extremely unwelcome. And we were going to do away with the entire 2014 and 2016 Act, all of those things that put those things in place. Because you know what, at the end of the day, people are talking about, again, drains on the economy and whatnot. those immigration policies were some of the biggest drains on our economy ever. And if you're not a person that believes in humanity and you want to take it right down to the economy, it was not good for our economy. We were wasting money having to pay people compensation for putting them in ridiculous situations. And actually, we were not getting the workforce that we need. And by doing things such as allowing asylum seekers to come into the country and having a completely ridiculous home office which didn't process things quickly enough and not allow them to work, not allow them to contribute to the economy, we were wasting more money. So we had policy to allow asylum seekers to work in this country after they were here for 6 months. And that is, you know, it's our duty to support them as people who are fleeing particular circumstances, but a lot of people have come here to rebuild their lives. Preventing them from working doesn't help them or their families. And doing away with things such as, so if you are a child that is born here to somebody who was not born here and is currently on a particular type of visa, that does not automatically make you British. You are asked to pay up to £1,000 and pass a good character test, which I don't understand how a 10-year-old could do. Is it about not stealing cola bottles from the corner shop? I have absolutely no idea. What is it? No detentions? All of these ridiculous things that are put in place to prevent children who are born here from being able to access their rights as citizens. And I know that I have I'm a governor at a school, and a lot of the young kids at the school were talking about how, you know, they're picking their GCSE options, they're thinking about going to university, but they may not have the opportunity to because they do not have British citizenship, despite being born here, despite being here from a young age, and unless their parents could find £1,000 to pay for their citizenship, they would not be allowed to access a university education at the same price as their other counterparts would in their class. And that is absolutely disgraceful. So we were going to do away with that. And I mention all of these policies now because I get really concerned. Obviously they were announced over a period of time, they're announced in a certain way, and it feels like you're already hearing some conversations that are shifting things. Now, if we are going to change Labour policy in certain areas, we need to tell people that we're changing Labour policy. We can't do it secretly. We didn't do it secretly when we announced this policy. And the one example that I can give is more recently, no recourse to public funds. So, you know, there was a lot of uproar about no recourse to public funds and the NHS surcharge. Now, the NHS surcharge and no recourse to public funds are both issues that people have raised, particularly in terms of healthcare workers, because they are the ones that are fighting COVID at the moment. And unfortunately, you know, Black communities are more likely to die from COVID. So they are on the front lines. And with the NHS surcharge, we said that we announced a policy as the party recently that we would remove the NHS surcharge for healthcare workers. Well, actually, it's already been announced that it is already the policy that we will remove the NHS surcharge for everybody. It's absolutely ridiculous that a national health service into which people pay. Now, remember, a lot of people that are being made to pay this people that are being made to pay this NHS surcharge pay national insurance just like the rest of us. It's an extra charge. It's not clear where the money goes, and it creates massive issues. And ending that disgraceful policy of no recourse to public funds. So all of those things are already there, and we need to make a point to protect that. And just to finish, immigration detention centres. Now, I think the thing that signalled for me a complete kind of sea change in how we discuss immigration is my visit to Labour Party conference in 2010, and then my visit to Labour Party conference in 2019. Now, my visit to Labour Party conference in 2010 and the discussions around immigration were completely different, because by the time we got to 2019, you saw a whole conference get up on its feet and give a standing ovation because we passed a policy that we would close immigration detention centres. And that for me was amazing. That for me is one of those markers as to how things had changed. Now, closing immigration detention centres, I think, is and making sure that people are not detained for longer than 28 days is one of those amazing landmark policies. And I remember going with Diane to visit Yarlsbridge Immigration Detention Centre. It took well over a year for the Home Office to let us in, and when we did, what we saw there was absolutely disgraceful. And the worst thing is that, you know, private companies are being given millions and millions of pounds. Private companies that have even been found to be defrauding the government, they're given millions and millions and millions of pounds to run these immigration detention centres. And these centres, do you know that after you count them all up, over 50% of the people they detained.
So Belle, we're going over time slightly, so end on this point. Great.
Yeah, over 50% of the people that that are in those immigration detention centres are eventually released into the community. That means the government is paying money, you know, millions of pounds for people's misery for no good reason, and detaining people for months on end for no good reason, catching them and putting them in again. So sorry, I've gone a bit over time, but I just wanted to end on immigration detention because of that Labour Party conference, and because of what that signalled to me, and because of how passionate I am about making sure that we do not start to roll back. We're about to end up in the worst economic recession that we have ever been in, and we know what happens then. We start to scapegoat migrants, but we should hold strong to those policies, remember that they exist, most importantly, and fight for them. Thank you.